Okay, so there's a fifth cup of wine apparently at the Seder, and we're trying to figure out where it came from and what its purpose is. And one of the things we already touched on is that there is a view who argues that the reason when we pour our fifth cup of wine, that we call it the cup of Eliyahu, is because Eliyahu's job is to figure out and solve dilemmas and unresolved issues in Judaism that have lingered across the generations, and he'll sort it out for us. So people want to argue that that's why we have a fifth cup called the cup of Elijah, because there are original sources, as we've seen, Rabbi Tarfon in the Mishnah, the Rambam even mentions it, that speak about the idea of a fifth cup of wine, except that the Rambam told us you pour it and you don't drink it. So that alludes to this dilemma. Are you supposed to have a fifth cup? Are you not supposed to have a fifth cup? One day when Eliyahu comes, he's going to resolve it. Okay, so people say that's how it gets its name, the cup of Elijah. But there's a problem with that theory. And the problem is when you look in the Shulchan Aruch, and you have to understand how these books work in order to fully appreciate the point. So when you have a look at the Shulchan Aruch, it's divided into sections. Each section has what is called simonim. A simon is like a chapter. And then each simon has seifim, which are paragraphs. So if you have information that belongs together, then you expect that it's going to be in the same simon. It's going to be in the same chapter. If information is put into two different simonim, that implies that the information is not linked. So if you have a look in the Shulchan Aruch, and you see that in one chapter, in one simon, it talks about the idea what happens if after the Seder, for whatever reason it is, a person has this desperate craving to have wine. I don't know if it's ever happened to you. At the end of the Seder, when you're ready to go to sleep, at who knows what time, suddenly you have this terrible craving that you have to have wine. But let's just assume that that was the case. So the Shulchan Aruch says, in that case, you're allowed to pour yourself a fifth cup of wine, provided that you read Hallel HaGadol, right? The Tehillim Hoydel Hashem Ki Tov, where you give gratitude for 26 different miracles or events in our history. In a different chapter, a different simon, it tells us in the Shulchan Aruch, and again we're referring here to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, where he kind of refined and clarified things that were already there in the original Shulchan Aruch. So he says, then the tradition is that you pour a fifth cup of wine over and above the cups that everybody has had to drink, and that cup is called the cup of Eliyahu. That immediately tells you the two different things here. There's a fifth cup of wine, and there's a cup of Eliyahu. Not only that, but the laws regard, not only are they different, not only are they recorded in different parts of the Shulchan Aruch, but the laws around these two cups are completely different. Because this fifth cup of wine is something potentially you would drink. It's to accommodate the person who's having their wine crisis, and they need to be able to have the other cup of wine, so we create this opportunity for them, with the opportunity to drink it. Whereas in the other chapter, which is a completely different topic, when we speak about the cup of Eliyahu, there it's absolutely clear that you don't drink it. Second of all, when we spoke about the first option of a fifth cup of wine, that was addressed to an individual, that if you, the individual, have an individual circumstance which requires you to have more wine, then we'll accommodate you in this particular way. Whereas the cup of Eliyahu is addressed to the crowd. You as a crowd, you're supposed to pour a fifth cup of wine, and the expression was that is over and above the other cups that you've already had to drink. So that implies that this is not something which is for the individual, it's for the entire crowd. So very clearly they're two different areas or two different laws or two different customs around wine, so we need to understand what's going on. So to get to the bottom of this, let's take a different angle to anything that we've discussed over the last few days. Completely different angle. And that is, any time that a person engages in any spiritual process, you expect that it's a progressive experience. In other words, you start, let's say, at an entry level, and then you improve, or you upgrade, or you engage at a higher level, and then at a higher level. And that's how it is, generally speaking, across the experience of Judaism. So for example, you're about to start counting the Omer. So counting the Omer is a progressive experience. On the first day, you're counting one day, you're focusing on a very basic area of self-development. By day 49, you've gone through a whole progression that hopefully has been very meaningful and even transformational. So when you go through the 4 cups of wine, there's much symbolism. You can read up in all kinds of sources about what the 4 cups of wine relate to, and the 4 expressions of redemption, and the 4 worlds, and the 4 states that of the neshama. Like there's all kinds of stuff that you could read up about the 4 cups of wine. The message is that in addition to the fact that you're trying to get through the Seder, which feels like a little bit of a marathon sometimes, right? And you're watching the clock, and you're trying to make sure how many pages are still left, and how fast is the person reading the Seder. Besides all of that, the ultimate goal of the Seder is that it should be a personal growth experience. And as you go through the Seder, something should be happening in terms of the conversation, in terms of your investment, in terms of your learning. Something should be happening that actually moves you forward. Now, the number 4 is a universal number in Judaism to represent an entire process, because the number 4 generally represents how things run. So for example, I mentioned the 4 worlds. That represents how the entire creation is divided into 4 spheres. But even back here in our limited reality, we know how much of life is defined by 4s. There are 4 life forms on this planet: the mineral, plant, animal, and human. There are 4 directions that define the reality of space. There are 4 seasons that define the reality of time. There are 4 basic states of existence: fire, air, water, and earth, and so on and so forth. Right? In the angelic world, there are 4 camps of angels. Most yontivs are built around things that have to do with a 4. So there are 4 names for many of the yontivs. There are 4 mitzvahs associated with many of the yontivs, etc. And even in halacha, there are many areas of halacha where things are divided into 4s. So whenever you want to describe how a person goes through a full experience of spiritual development, you're very often going to use the number 4 to represent that, which then tells you if 4 represents an entire system, then 5 represents something that is greater than the system. So very often, there's the amount of effort we could invest in something, and then there is the result of that effort that's out of our control. So in other words, you could push and elevate yourself 4 levels of growth, and then a 5th level of growth is something that's out of your hands and very often a gift from Hashem. And that's what the 5th cup of wine at the Seder is supposed to represent. We do our bit, and then Hashem accelerates the effect of what we've done, so we end up having an experience which is greater than the experience we should be able to craft for ourselves. That's what the 5th cup represents. Now, on a number line, I could say 1, 2, 3, 4. In that case, I'm essentially looking at each unit as separate from every other unit. Yes, of course, it's on a number line, it belongs to the same reality, but each one is separate. Whereas if I say 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, then I'm immediately linking each one to the preceding and to the following one. Because now I'm saying, obviously, 1st is relative to 2nd, and 2nd is relative to 1st. So when I say that there is a 5th cup, then I'm illustrating that whatever this 5th cup represents, because now we've defined that there are 4 steps of my investment and my growth that I could work on. And then there is a 5th dimension that is beyond that. The very fact that I call it the 5th dimension, rather than, let's say, an alternative reality or another dimension or a higher dimension. The fact that I use the word 5th, that tells me that it is relative to the 4 steps that preceded, which basically means in simple English that this new reality, this new dimension, is something that is a result of what I've done. I did 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and therefore the 5th again is relative, is bound in what I did. In other words, I created that reality. But if I don't refer to it as the 5th, then basically what I'm saying is, whatever comes next, nothing to do with me. Okay, so let's try and understand the distinction between the two. Before we do that, we've already pointed out that it sounds like the custom has changed over the course of history. Because if you go back to the Rambam, and prior to that you go back to the period called the Go'onim, which are the great spiritual leaders after the Gemara, And if you go back to the Gemara, because we've seen the debate between Rabbi Tarfon and the sages in the Mishnah, it seems like there was a period in older Jewish history, medieval and further back, where there was this concept of every person pouring a fifth cup of wine and not drinking it. Whereas the idea of what we do, which is the cup of Eliyahu, that is a single cup poured and placed on the table on behalf of the entire crowd and nobody drinks it, that is not recorded in any of those original sources, which implies that that is a custom that emerged later in history. So we would have to ask ourselves the question, why did the custom change? Why did the one fade? And why did the other one manifest? And when you consider that the fifth cup of wine, in whichever form it is speaking about something greater than what we could achieve through our efforts, then there's clearly a distinction over here between what could result from our efforts, but it's called the fifth, meaning it's still linked. It's as if you made it happen, versus another cup that is not even called the fifth cup, like it says in the Shulchan Aruch, you pour another cup more than what all the people have drunk. That implies something that's out of range, that's beyond anything we could achieve. So let's try and understand this. If you had to meet the Rambam, or any of these other great sages, I'm using the Rambam because he's the one who wrote about pouring this fifth cup of wine and not drinking it. If you had to meet the Rambam, what kind of an individual do you anticipate you'd be meeting?
Scholar.
Try to be a great scholar. What else?
Serious.
You'd be very serious. What else?
Pious.
Pious, exactly. He'd be an incredibly spiritually developed human being. And that would be true for all of the great sages of those and earlier generations. Not only the sages, but the reality is if you had to meet a person, an average Jew from the Rambam's time, they'd probably be a lot more knowledgeable and a lot more engaged in their Judaism than the average Jew today. Because this whole notion of Jews being unaware of their Judaism is a relatively new phenomenon. Like back in history, there was no such thing as a secular Jew. It didn't exist. You might have had more learned and less learned. But generally speaking, even the person who was not learned was very engaged in their Judaism. Of course, there would always be anomalies, but I'm saying by and large, across the board. So our appreciation is, the Gemara actually summarizes this in a very unique way. The Gemara says, if earlier generations were of the caliber of angels, then we're of the caliber of humans. And if earlier generations were the caliber of humans, then we are the caliber of donkeys. Basically what the Gemara is illustrating is that there's a chronic spiritual decline across the generations. That's just how it is. So there's lack of spiritual sensitivity that we have, there's lack of knowledge that we have, there's levels of observance that have eroded over the course of history. We're just not as much invested in the Jewish world, I'm saying on average, than they were back then. So it's fair to say that at that time, especially when you're dealing with the leadership, people like the Rambam, etc., it's fair to say that they could rely on how much learning they had done, how much investment they had made, how much piety they had achieved, that they could say, honestly, I'll go through my 4 steps, and then what's going to result from those 4 steps is something that I deserve, something that I earned, something that I worked on. So that new reality that Hashem is going to give me, so to speak, as a gift, I can call it the 5th cup. I can call it the 5th step in a process of which I did 4 steps. It's relative to what I've done, which would also explain why the Rambam's view is that everybody gets a cup, because everybody is at a level that they deserve some kind of a spiritual boost, which is going to be represented by this 5th cup of wine. However, as time went on and people became less engaged in their Judaism, and not everybody was at that level that they could believe or ensure that they're going to go through these steps and Hashem is going to respond, so this custom disappeared. Because it was no longer the reality of people that you could say, I am so developed, I'm so spiritual, I'm so engaged, that I can activate this 5th reality. Instead, what replaced it? So one of my favorite things on the first night of Pesach is that there's a tradition that you don't lock your doors on the first night of Pesach. You ever heard this? It's a very popular tradition in Johannesburg. You don't lock your doors on the first night of Pesach. Why not? So the Torah tells us, and we're going to read this on the first day of Pesach, that the first night of Pesach is called Leil Shimurim. It's a little bit of an ambiguous term. Leil Shimurim means a night of guarding. So from this we understand that this is a night where Hashem protects us at a much higher level than any other day of the year. And so we don't have to protect ourselves. And in fact, if you try to lock yourself up, that implies you don't really trust that Hashem protects us. The word Shimurim has an alternative meaning. That's why I said it's an ambiguous statement. Because the word Shimurim means, well, what's the matzah called that we have? The Shmura matzah, right? What's Shmura matzah? What does that mean? That somebody kept an eye on this matzah to make sure that it wouldn't be exposed to any water or anything that could in any way lower the value or the strictness of the matzah. So you're kind of keeping an eye on it because you want to have it for a very special occasion, which is the Seder. That implies that Leil Shimurim is a time also that Hashem, so to speak, keeps his eye on to reserve it for some kind of special occasion. Now the Gemara tells us, B'Nisan niga'alu, or B'Nisan asidin lihiga'el, that the month of Nisan, and more specifically on Pesach, that's when the Jewish people were liberated from Egypt. And therefore, it's the ripest of seasons for Hashem to liberate us again with the coming of Mashiach. That's the other interpretation of Leil Shimurim, that this is a night that is reserved more than any other time of the year for Mashiach to come. Now, who's supposed to announce Mashiach's arrival? Eliyahu. So therefore, there's another version of why it is that you don't lock your door. In fact, it says more than that. It says you leave your doors open. Okay, can you imagine this? Not only do you not lock it, imagine leaving your door wide open on the night of Pesach. But that was how they would do it. And the reason they did it was, it says, because then if Eliyahu comes, firstly, he'll be able to walk into our house and tell us Mashiach is here. And secondly, we'll be able to walk out to greet Mashiach without any delays. Opening all your 14 locks on your door, be able to go out to greet Mashiach. That tells you that Pesach night, generally, and this cup of wine called the cup of Eliyahu specifically, has nothing to do with resolving the question of whether or not you're supposed to drink or only pour the cup of wine. And it has everything to do with the fact that this is a night of faith. This is a night where we express that every single Jewish person has faith in the coming of Mashiach. As we know, how do we know? From the famous song, Ani Mamin. Ani Mamin be'emunah shlema. I believe with absolute faith, b'vias HaMashiach, in the coming of Mashiach. A song that has really been part of the accompaniment of Jewish history, even at the most difficult of times, because we have this absolute faith. Now, there's a big difference between faith and spiritual growth and development. Because spiritual growth and development is relative to who you are and how far you've gone, how much you've learned, how much you've applied what you've learned to your life. So, when I'm talking about that fifth cup of wine, which is the fifth in a series of 4, implying that I've done what I had to in the series of 4, and now Hashem is giving me a fifth opportunity, a fifth perspective, a fifth dimension, that is very much about personal growth and development and is relative to each individual. That's why the Rambam says you pour each person a cup, because each person is at their level, and their so-called fifth dimension experience is going to be relative to them. Faith is not relative. Faith is universal. Whether we are conscious or not of that faith, faith is built into the very DNA of our soul. And we know this because look at our history, including very recent history, and you'll see again and again that you have disconnected, secular Jewish people who are not invested in their Jewish growth, they're not invested in learning the Torah, etc. And yet, when there's a faith moment, their faith comes to the fore. And suddenly they'll stand up as the proudest Jew, and they'll refuse to do things under pressure for the sake of their Judaism, because faith is a universal. Therefore, this cup of wine, called the cup of Eliyahu, the Shulchan Aruch says you pour 1 cup for all those who are at the table. Because what we're implying over here is that this depth of faith that we all have, including the faith in the coming of Mashiach, is equally shared by all of us. As as history developed, and we lost the art that they had in the time of the Rambam, etc., the art of being so spiritually invested that we could get ourselves into another spiritual realm, what developed alongside that was a feeling of drawing closer to the time of Mashiach, and therefore that faith that we have in the coming of Mashiach becomes a little bit more accessible and a little bit more real to us. And as you go through history, you'll see that, I can tell you just, in the last couple of decades, you can see the distinction between once upon a time, when I was a kid, not so long ago, that if you spoke about Mashiach, people looked at you like you fell off the moon. And in today's world, you speak about Mashiach, it's very much the language that people use, including secular Jews. They use the language. We really need Mashiach. Just the other day, somebody said it to me. I was quite taken aback. They was like, we really need Mashiach to come. I was thinking, it's funny coming from you. If it comes from the rabbi, it's kind of normal. It's funny coming from you. I even remember at one point, there was a rabbi here in a shul here in Joburg, where the committee of the shul put him on notice because he was mentioning Mashiach too frequently in his sermons. So they had an issue with that, How could you mention Mashiach so much in your sermons? That was such a funny concept. So, as a result, this tradition of the cup of Eliyahu came into Jewish practice more recently, because the idea of feeling more aware of Mashiach is a more recent development. And so really the take-home message for us is that as we go into the Pesach Seder, realistically, we are probably not as spiritually aware as we should, and we don't necessarily have some kind of transformational experience every year at the Seder. Please God, we do, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. But at the same time, the one thing that is very much guaranteed at our Seder is that we have the opportunity to plug in to the energy of Mashiach and to the awareness and the faith in Mashiach and the coming of Eliyahu. So when we pour that cup of wine, it's with a consciousness that it could really be served to Eliyahu at the Seder. And then, please God, that way we can have, as the Gemara says, that Nisan becomes the month of redemption, and that we can go straight from our Seder to eat a nice lamb on the spit in the Beis HaMikdash, the Korban Pesach, please God, with Mashiach.